Hey everybody, welcome to week 4. We're making some good progress, wrapping up section 1. This week we have a quiz due by the end of the week, so make sure you complete that. And I want to note that this lecture will not be on the quiz, although it will carry over to be on the final exam, and it will not be on quiz 2. But I want to emphasize, some of these questions may be on the final exam, and it is essential to make sure you understand the definitions that we as a group, as a collective, will rely on when debating these issues and using these terms in our discussions and in our term paper for this course. So today we're going to look into some ideologies and philosophies that have persisted in the United States and have sparked the systems of government that we have in the United States today and their classical origins. So let's begin. When in today's lecture, I'm going to ask a couple overarching questions, and I hope this can help structure the flow of the content. So first, we're going to ask, what are some of the ideologies present among well-known American thinkers and politicians? We're not going to dive into the individual politicians as much, but we will explore the different philosophies and ideologies and make sure we have a concrete definition for each. Who are some of the political theorists who guided the first interpretations of these ideologies? We'll look at a theorist, maybe two for each philosophy, and see how their train of thoughts and their works developed over the years and inspired our founding fathers and resulted in the guiding political philosophies that we utilize today. How can we examine public policies through the lens of different political ideologies? Well, that explains itself right there. We will do that throughout today's lecture. And that'll be fun because we'll take a theoretical overarching approach to examining different policy approaches. And I think it's beneficial to see policies that you support and continue to support them. I want to emphasize nobody should be changing their political mindsets or political ideologies in this course, but it's beneficial to look at how we view politics through a different lens, through the lens of security or liberty or other lenses that we can identify throughout the lecture. And then finally, we'll wrap up and make sure we understand how this all relates to American government. All right, so a favorite place for me to start is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism as a philosophy is pretty straight to the point, pretty simple. When we decide to make any action as an individual or as a state, we must try our best to quantify the value of that action. And once we've quantified the value for us and our society, we then have to, if we are being a true utilitarian, prioritize the creation of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The utilitarians rely on the principle of utility. When simply looking at this, we understand the principle of utility states that all actions should bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number. On its surface, it is a phenomenal philosophy, and I think it tracks quite well. We all want to create the greatest good to the greatest individuals. But when we look at this philosophy in practice, you see a bit of a challenge to maintaining true utilitarianism at all times. We also, without diving into too much detail on the concept at large, I do want to just present some different directions that philosophers go when debating utilitarianism. So when we look at John Stuart Mills and Jeremy Bentham, our leading political theorists with utilitarianism, you see two different forms of utilitarianism surface, and they've developed in recent years as well. So we see the first form, emphasized by both Bentham and Mills, act utilitarianism. View this as, and of course we will not be quizzed on act or rule utilitarianism, but for the conversation's sake, it's beneficial to know, and it may come in handy in your term paper or discussions. You may be able to say, I see that you are a rule utilitarian with this response, blah, blah, blah. So an act utilitarian is one who, in any given situation, would choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. This requires constant evaluation. If you follow the work of Jeremy Bentham, this would mean that you're constantly applying the hedonistic calculus. Hedonistic calculus is basically stating you take 7 questions and you ask them about any action, and it helps you quantify the value of that action. And then at the end of asking yourself these 7 questions, the utilitarian act should be clear. So, applying the hedonistic calculus, I would say, how great will the pleasure be? How long will the pleasure last? How likely is it that pleasure will happen? Will it happen to how many people? How common is the pleasure? How immediate is it? How likely is it to be followed by pain? So we see the answer to these questions will help us quantify and measure the benefits to the number of people that our actions will provide. Now, John Stuart Mills added to that discussion as he said, well, when we think about utilitarianism, we have to understand that some pleasures are better than others. He uses the classic example of, would you rather be a peaceful and amazing angel for 70 years who does nothing but bring beautiful good to everybody it cross paths with, but you have a limited life, you only live 70 years? Or would you rather be a happy clam for all of eternity? You don't do much, you don't have much purpose, but you do have the bliss that comes with living in warm waters, having shelter in your shell, and whatever you may have as a peaceful and happy clam. So John Stuart Mills identifies that many people would identify, many utilitarians would even rationally identify living as the angel as the best move, while others may identify living as the happy clam, which reveals a prioritization of certain pleasures over others. Some may overvalue emotional and philosophical intellectual pleasures, while some may overvalue physical pleasures. So backtracking, two ways to look at utilitarianism through the works of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mills. Again, I will emphasize you do not have to remember that, although I think it's useful to understand. And we want to understand quickly, what is another type of utilitarianism used among political philosophers? Rule utilitarianism. We understand that at utilitarianism, the process of determining what is the greatest good for the greatest number, using that hedonistic calculus every single day, well, that is tedious and might create more harm having to put yourself through such an intellectual strain every single day than you may imagine. So it may be better to apply rule utilitarianism, which is where we ought to live by a set of rules that, when applied generally, are likely to lead to the greatest good to the greatest number. That's kind of like the modernized version of utilitarianism. How can we generally understand these rules that we live in society and apply them to make sure that we are generally creating the most good for the most amount of people? A rule utilitarian would say it is a generally good practice to stop at stoplights, to protect individuals around us and ourselves. An act utilitarian may at times determine that it is best to not stop at a stop sign or a stoplight. So we see these practices being maintained, this philosophy being maintained through a lens of rule utilitarianism to this very day. Now, why is there a picture of a little cart and some people in the bottom right of the screen? Some of you already know exactly what this is, but some of you may not. So what you see at the bottom is what's known as the trolley car thought experiment. This helps us illustrate what a utilitarian truly would do and the strain that's put through some utilitarian decisions. So we see in the bottom right image, you see an individual standing next to a lever, and then there's a trolley car in front of him, one direction going to hit one person and the other direction going to hit four. The trolley car is currently on track to hit the four individuals. These four individuals and the one, they are the exact same, copy and paste. And by the way, you can't change the circumstances. You have to make A or B decisions in this thought experiment. So you have the chance, the option to pull that lever and move the trolley car and avoid four people's deaths and decide to have one person's death. Now, in a classroom environment, we would have a lot of fun going back and forth about the different decisions you would make, and then we would see that many of us would apply utilitarian practice. We would pull the lever and make the car redirect to the one person and save the lives of the four. So now, what about that image to the left? And that portrays the action of a true utilitarian. A utilitarian would pull that lever. Now, if you look at the image to the left, you see that instead of it being a lever, you're on a bridge overhanging this trolley. Instead of it being a point where you could redirect it, you have a person next to you on that bridge. Now, this is a bigger person. If you push them over the ledge, they'll stop that trolley. It'll stop in its tracks and it will save those four people. You know that for a fact. Now, would you be a true utilitarian and push the individual on the tracks to save the two, taking matters a little bit more so into your own hands? Well, many would start to say, well, we would not risk the life of the one to save the four when you have to put your actions to that extent. Well, that is an argument that John Stuart Mills points out when he kind of identifies the different values of pleasures and the different extent to which utilitarianism can truly be applied. So when you go throughout your daily activities, ask yourself, what is the utilitarian act? Am I going to apply that, or am I going to, and if I do apply that, am I going to do it in an act utilitarian where I will determine this every single moment, or will I apply rules as a rule utilitarian to guide me through my general daily life and provide the greatest good for the greatest number? So the next key term we're going to explore is libertarianism. This is an ideology that is relatively new in its usage. In the past, we see in in 1700s France, it got its first uses as it represented a more radical viewpoint of an almost anarchist state of being. So a libertarian, our current understanding, emphasizes individual liberties and believes in minimal state intervention in the free market and additionally our private lives as citizens. When we look at its origins, we see early uses of the term representing anarchist, but in the 1950s developed to represent a preference for limited government intervention that kind of merges classical liberalism, which we'll look at in the next slide, with radical anti-statism. This is a political ideology that really focuses on small scale governance. You want little to no government at all. We will look at the state of nature in just a moment. A libertarian is likely to be one who views the state of nature in the most positive mindset. Foundations of libertarianism include individualism and individual rights. Only individuals make choices and are responsible for their actions. And you see the life, liberty, and property sentiments echoed within libertarianism, although not as perfectly represented as classical liberalism does. And you see this sense of spontaneous order and rule of law. Rule of law will come naturally through spontaneous order, and spontaneous order, simply put, is that sources of order do not originate from a central authority, but are better originated through spontaneous, natural order of people playing their individual roles within a greater society. And we see that under this concept, we kind of pulls from the social contract theory to focus on the sentiment that individuals sign in to identify within the state, although they do want as little state intervention as possible. We look at, and we see, of course, limited government and free market, as I previously mentioned. To cover those previous bullet points, we understand that it does merge classical liberalism with radical anti-statism, especially as it was developed in the 1950s. And one of our primary philosophers we can look at with libertarian ideologies is John Locke. He never identified as a libertarian. Of course, writing in the early 1700s, the term libertarian was viewed as more of a radical term and viewpoint. John Locke did not identify as it, but his works sparked the sentiments of many libertarians at the time and to date. Now let's explore the term liberalism. We're going to explore liberalism and conservatism in this course and in the lecture today, but it's very important to understand that we're presenting generalized, concrete definitions that we all will rely on in this course. We probably all have a different starting point in understanding liberalism and conservatism as a whole. The origins of these definitions come from the classical works, primarily liberalism coming from John Locke, Adam Smith. With conservatism, you see primarily Edmund Burke and others that developed the theory in later years. But it's very important to understand that we're not using party definitions today. When we think of liberalism, we're thinking of John Locke, a philosophy that has guided the sentiments of many Americans and that's guided contemporary conservatives and liberals alike to think how they do today. So, liberalism. emphasizes individual rights, civil liberties, equality, social justice, and limited government at its origins. And that primarily the role of the state is to protect these liberties and promote conditions of human flourishing. So we look at the underlying dimensions of this definition: individual rights, civil liberties, equality, social justice, and limited government. These foundations originate primarily from the works of John Locke and other liberal philosophers of the time. Now, we also understand that in contemporary American politics, liberalism has developed and has been generally represented within the Democratic Party, and it's developed in a way that it doesn't perfectly represent the limited government sentiments that it had in the past, although it does at times. So we see that when you look at the role of the state, you see how limited government, the limited government dimension snowballs into what it is today. The primary role of the state, of course, is to protect these liberties and promote conditions for human flourishing. So the state at times has to build up their capacities to be able to provide these protections and ensure the liberties that our, for example, Bill of Rights provides. So we see those underlying dimensions represented by the works of John Locke, and that government intervention, when you think about a liberal perspective, tends to be justified through concepts like the social contract. The social contract basically states when we align within a state, we have to forfeit certain rights. The forfeiture of those rights comes with the guarantee and protection of other rights that we may desire. Think of it, I always like to give the most oversimplified example of this. Before there was ever a state, you had the right to pillage and steal and do whatever you desired to build up your individual home. Now, if you're in the state of nature and you're now joining a state, you are accepting that you are forfeiting your right that exists in the state of nature to pillage and steal and do whatever you desire for the protection of your property and other rights. So this social contract, liberal ideology, states that you will forfeit certain rights for the protection and maintenance of others within a state. We see liberalism has developed significantly over recent years, and the historical foundations were focused around individual liberty, natural rights, limited government to protect those freedoms, free markets, private property, rule of law, and constitutionalism, freedom of speech and religion. Liberalism would have a form of spontaneous order, but with a state's role in guiding that positive relations. Now, when we look at contemporary foundations of liberalism, we see that develop to more likely represent social justice and equality of opportunities emphases, government intervention in the economy, especially regarding welfare and regulation, to ensure that liberties are protected and that the common good of human flourishing is promoted. We see the supporting of civil rights, labor protections quite heavily in the United States, education, healthcare, all through the lens of these are responsibilities of the state. So that is a shift you see where limited government turns into more so a responsibility of the government to provide human flourishing. And you see emphases on personal freedoms. Think traditionally in contemporary days, speech, gender rights, reproductive rights, things of those nature. And more likely you can understand this overarching as a belief that government can be a tool for positive change, as well as something that must be restricted to ensure the protection of liberties. Now, how does conservatism, I struggle to say it at times, especially after I've rambled on so long, how does it differ? Well, conservatism emphasizes tradition, social stability, gradual change, traditional values and institutions. Contemporary definitions maintain a focus on free market capitalism, individual liberties, and that the role of the state is to promote stability. Of course, we'll look at the underlying dimensions that are present quite heavily in Edmund Burke's first origins of conservatism. So these are tradition, social stability, gradual change, traditional values and institutions, individual liberties, and that the state has an objective primarily to promote stability. So a conservative following the works of Edmund Burke would view society as a kind of an organic whole, and every individual within this society plays a specific part. They have rights within the society that they're granted, but in addition, they have duties that they must maintain, playing their role within society. When we look at Edmund Burke, we'll go into Burke's conservatism in the next slide, but we see that there is a heavy, heavy emphasis on the value of tradition and the focus on gradual change. 1700s, a period of stark revolutions. So we see Edmund Burke being the calm, retained voice, representing a Alexander Hamiltonian kind of way of viewing the state. The state needs to provide security above all things. And the best way to do that is by respecting what we have inherited from past generations and making gradual change. Revolutionary change tends to be bloody and violent, and we need to have a tamed gradual development of our society. Now, when you look at historical conservatism, you see foundations in tradition, of course, as I'm mentioning, custom, established institutions. An institution is not just a built-up system that we operate. It is something that generations have developed before us, and we have inherited, luckily, their progress. Additionally, traditional conservatism maintains a focus on skepticism of rapid change or revolutions. They tend to be bloody and fearful. Hierarchy and social order, it was implemented over time and has some rational reason for existence. Moral and religious values are something that should be encouraged. A belief that human reason is limited and social stability depends on inherited wisdom. So it is our human nature. We'll look in a second when we look at the state of nature and Thomas Hobbes' perspective on it, but human nature is a bit corrupted, and we must have systems in place to restrict this corruption and inherit the wisdom that we have obtained through past generations through developments. Continuing to examine conservatism in a contemporary lens, we see a development that maintained a focus on that actually pulled from traditional liberalism, like the works of John Locke, and focuses on free market capitalism, a limited government and with a focus on individual responsibilities, a preservation, of course, maintaining the Edmund Burke foundations of tradition and value, primarily through the lens of religion and family. We also see some focuses on nationalism, strong borders, law and order, and opposition to large-scale social engineering, but maintaining a focus on moral values that should be encouraged within society. So conservatism, after going through traditional and contemporary foundations, we understand as a political philosophy that emphasizes tradition, social stability, gradual change, and with a heavy emphasis on gradual change, traditional values and institutions, a contemporary development for free market capitalism, individual liberties, and the role of the state is to promote stability. So, who is Edmund Burke and how can he help us understand the foundations of classical conservatism? Well, Edmund Burke, of course known as the first conservative, was an English politician who represented the English Parliament for 28 years. When he represented the English Parliament, it's interesting to see that he viewed representation in a unique way. He viewed that the representatives elected should not govern based on what the general population desires, as these were individuals elected based on their professionalism and expertise. Instead, they should govern based on their inherent instincts and what they believe is best for the population they represent. So this is a form of trustee versus delegate representation, and we see that Edmund Burke emphasizes a trustee approach. We'll look at this again later on in the course. So his most famous work, Reflections on the Revolution, was a focus on the English Revolution that he had previously, in a form, been inspired by. Now, it's worth noting he was not a fan of this revolution and viewed revolution as very detrimental to society, as it harms our ability to inherit those previous institutions passed down from previous generations. It's worth noting he was never a scholar that, although most of the political philosophers in this course we look at were scholars, we see Montesquieu was a French judge, also known for his philosophical works, John Locke, Rousseau, nearly every Thomas Hobbes, all known for their intellectual works, Edmund Burke known for his political career. Now, and this makes sense because when he talked about governance and political theory at large, he was primarily and exclusively focused on the aspects of what works in practice. We're not very concerned with how the world ought to be, and thinks any focus on theory and utopian writing can be detrimental to realist understandings of the society we live in and give us ideas of grandeur that may harm our attempts to create a system of productivity. He was a member of the English Whig Party while in Parliament. It's worth noting, grew up in Ireland in a Quaker household. But just a little bit of the background on Edmund Burke. Now, when you look at his understanding of human nature, he has a sentiment that people do not have the best foundations, and they require a state and they require structure through society to regulate those inherent detriments of human nature. Now, with that train of thought, he of course would be like Alexander Hamilton and be fearful of the people, what Alexander Hamilton and our founding fathers referred to as the mob. And has a anti-democracy sentiment, often citing the detriments and the death of the Athenian democracy in classical works. Now, he also, additionally, at building off of last week's lecture, presents a sentiment that political parties are an essential and necessary part of governance, and we must maintain them in society, writing this before the formation of political parties within the United States, helping rationalize that sentiment. Now, let's see. When we look at Burke's conservatism at large, we do see that Burke, it maintains that gradual change over revolution, of course. We prioritize what works in practice over what works in theory. He is against utopian writing, thinking that if you're thinking in the clouds, your real ideas of governance will only apply to, well, the clouds. Pulling a little bit of the Aristotle-Socrates discussion right there. But that's, of course, a different discussion. He argues that when you look at society and what virtues should be encouraged among the general population, prudence, patience, and a tamed mindset is the best virtue that should be encouraged in society, and of course does not believe in a true democracy, presenting that foundation of conservatism that is relied upon and developed, of course, gradually throughout the years. Now, worth stating, all of these definitions, we could view them as breathing and changing with each generation, with each era. We see conservatism in contemporary definitions maintains a focus on free market capitalism, but we remember that one of the primary protectionist policies during our founding fathers' formation of the first political party were tariffs. And we see that contemporary politics represents conservatism within the Republican Party, although Republican Party are currently advocating for the use of tariffs. So we see political ideology does not always immediately translate to public policy and breathes and changes with each generation, with each representative, changing the way we view these collectives. But when we talk about liberalism, when we talk about conservatism, libertarianism, and utilitarianism, we rely on the definitions and foundations identified in the lecture today. So, a little less divisive of a term, one that I like to focus on, liberty. If you want to explore this concept in more detail in your textbook, page 11 and 12 focuses on liberty and the conflict that it has with, as they framed it, order and equality, as we view it in this course, security. But before we do that, let's create a foundational understanding of what liberty is. Liberty is the greatest freedom of the individual that is consistent with the greatest freedom of other individuals within society. I always like to encourage you to reframe terms in your own language. I always like to say liberty is your ability to be and do whatever you want to be and do up until it impedes my and my neighbor's ability to be and do whatever I want to be and do. Very wordy, probably not the most efficient way of defining it. I think the most efficient way of defining it is right there on the slide, but it's always beneficial to understand it in your own language and be able to echo that sentiment with different words. So when we look at the textbook and see that conflict between liberty and order, we see it as addressed through the examination of two primary liberties, our liberty of privacy and security, and how they can be prioritized at times over individual liberties, like during tragedies. Think of Japanese internment camps and the individual privacy and security of certain individuals were restricted for the greater liberty of the society. That was during World War II. And think of a more contemporary example of the Patriot Act after 9/11, as we had our liberties, securities, and security and privacy protected with our liberties restricted online. Sorry, my words today. We also see the textbook explores the concept through the lens of liberty versus equality, as it's represented through the struggle for voting rights in the U.S. and for the fight for gay marriage rights. If you are curious about that, you can explore that in our textbooks, page 11 and 12. But today's lecture, we're going to explore it through the lens of liberty versus security. So, how can we see liberty versus security? There's been an everlasting conflict, as we know, between these two concepts, as any governmental action tends to prioritize one over the other. We can look at two pivotal pieces of legislation in contemporary days. The first being the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001, what I previously mentioned as a prioritization of liberty, a prioritization of security and a restriction of liberty after the 9/11 threat. We see this expanded the application of tools already being used against drug dealers and organized crimes, in addition to creating a greater surveillance network within the federal government. So we also see backtracks of these type of prioritizations occur later on, as we later prioritize liberty in the year of 2015 under the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015, which ended the bulk collection of all record keeping under Section 215 of the Patriot Act and allowed challenges to national security letter gag orders. So we see throughout our history, we have a constant ebb and flow between prioritizations of security through the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001 and then later prioritizations of liberty through the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015. When you are in the state of nature, which I will explain in just a few slides, which of these would you prioritize? Actually, last week, in the in-person section of this course, I had the class get into groups and discuss the ideal system of government they would implement. And the final question they had to answer was, in this system, when the system is threatened with a security threat, either military, foreign security threat, domestic security threat, or a pandemic, a non-visible security threat, how should the state respond? Should it prioritize liberty or security? And you see this is a question that our representatives and we as citizens struggle to answer with every new threat. Now, let's quickly understand, before we dive into the state of nature, a difference between tyranny and anarchy. Well, they're two sides of an opposite spectrum, of a single spectrum. And we understand that they were what the founding fathers from different political party collectives were fearful of and incentivized the formation of the systems of government that they advocated for. We see anarchy. It's simply viewed as the absence of government. There is no government at all. A libertarian might, be somewhat okay with this, especially using that 1950s definition, which was relied upon specifically right around that time, but has developed to be what we have today. We see they would not have too much disdain for anarchy. But when we look at the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, we remember that the Federalists were very fearful of the mob, of anarchy, overwhelming the state or whatever small scale state that could exist at the time. And that is why they advocated for the building up of a large state. We also understand the term tyranny. Tyranny is a cruel and oppressive government or rule, opposite side of the spectrum regarding the extent of governance. And tyranny was what the Democratic Republicans were extensively fearful during the founding debates in the 1790s, and why they advocated for a strong state governments that were loosely united through a confederal system of government. And of course, as I just emphasized, fear of these resulted in the formation of the first political party system. And I've mentioned these terms multiple times, but it is essential to make sure we have concrete definitions of these terms. And a fascinating angle our textbook chooses to take when discussing anarchy is on page 7, as they state that many political scientists do even agree that in the state of nature, you can see that there isn't as clearly a system of pure anarchy as we may visualize. that anarchy is not exactly possible, and instead leadership will be concentrated in the hands of small militant groups. And well, we could see these groups. If there was no established government, we would likely have power designated into the hands of what they refer to as quote unquote indistinguishable from gangsters and mobs and mafias and collectives like that. So would anarchy result in us living as individuals or us living under small scale militant group leadership? A question for any political theorist, and you can go any direction answering that question. So here we are. We've made it to the state of nature. So the state of nature, simply understood, is the condition of all people before there was a state or civil society. Think of it as the caveman days, when every individual was left to their own devices. We all had to stand up and defend ourselves. When we look at the state of nature, we do not have to remember this, but we understand that there are two primary laws of nature. First law, we will all desire peace, at least individually for ourselves. And the second law, we must forfeit certain rights in order to obtain peace. We will revisit these two laws of nature in a second when we explore the social contract. And these two laws of nature are what results in us gradually leaving this system in which there is no government or structure around us to creating a state. Now, first, I do want to ask, in the state of nature, before any formation of civil society, any state, any small scale communities even, are we peaceful creatures? Do we have positive relations? Are we at war? Is there constant conflict? Is it as, hello, is it as Thomas Hobbes puts it, and it's perpetual war? Life is nasty, brutish, and short? Or is it, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and sometimes John Locke would argue, it's absolute equality. It's the opportunity for every individual to have as much as any other individual could equally have. Now, we do not have to remember exactly what each political philosopher says about this state of being, but we do want to ask ourselves this when we explore the role of this state. Before we ever created a state, we lived in society. If we were to eventually align with one, why would we? Would we do it because, well, over the last few months, we've built up this nice little collective. We have a little property here, and we want this property to be protected. We don't want us to be constantly worrying about the threat of others, so we'll create a little community for the security of our properties. Or are you saying that in the state of nature, you're struggling so much to maintain anything that you'll align with a state for the protection of life? And that will eventually result in you obtaining property. But at first, you're aligning with the state because you want safety. Why do we create a state, and what is the role of that state? When we look at John Locke and his views on the state of nature, we see that John Locke has a sentiment that all are generally created equal, and within this system, we are all equal creatures. Everyone lives in harmony if we follow the laws of nature. It's the governments that tend to corrupt men, not men that corrupt governments. And one can't let goods spoil or limit others from obtaining those resources in this state. That is one of the reasons why we eventually create a state. We see that labor justifies private ownership because you have the rights to the fruit of your labor, as later philosophers like to put it. So the state of nature, the state of being before there was a government to guide us. Now, Thomas Hobbes, when you ask him what this state is like, well, he would say, very fearful. That quote I said previously, life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. A famous quote from the work of Thomas Hobbes. He represents a prioritization of security. Remember that dilemma between liberty versus security. Well, Thomas Hobbes would almost always say we need to prioritize security when debating this issue. He wrote the Leviathan, which we will not go into detail in today's class, but it focuses on the role and responsibility of the state. He fears that state of nature. and is generally understood when you look at him as an individual, a pacifist. It's fascinating to understand the influence that history can have on some philosophers. We notice that the English Civil War, spanning in the 1650s roughly, came at the end of Thomas Hobbes' life. He was an older man. That is actually when a lot of his works on political theory originate, after the age of 60. And if you were a man above the age of 60 and you were experiencing a civil war, would you be excited about the revolution of the future? Would you be fearful about the threat of the past? Well, rationally thinking, Thomas Hobbes maintains that perfectly. Fearful of the past progress that could be overwhelmed and dismantled through a revolution. We see in his time emphasis of defense of monarchies and arguments against democracies as they are ripe with mob rule and vulnerable to the threats of the mob. We see him prioritizing security over liberty. Now, standing in opposition, we see John Locke, representing the prioritization of liberty, especially in the state of nature. Now, it's also worth noting the years he lived. Coming up, writing in the early years of that same English Civil War. And of course, how would a younger individual in their roughly 20s view a civil war in comparison to a 60-year-old individual? Probably a bit more optimistically, with a bit more excitement, revolutionary determination. Well, that is exactly how John Locke is represented. We can understand these two philosophers just rationally by thinking about their age as they experienced a civil war in their own communities. So John Locke later on writes the Two Treatises of Government. In this, he focuses on many things, but primarily the role of the state, human nature, the role of religion, and the basis of education. So, but before we go into all of that, we have to understand how he views the state of nature. State of nature is a state of equality through the eyes of John Locke. We see that he emphasizes that when we live in a state of nature, the first thing that we will do is create our own property. You see the life, liberty, and property quote represented there, although we will look at that through another lens later on in today's lecture. He sees that property will be created in the state of nature, and we will align with a state in order to protect these properties and to protect our individual liberties, creating the foundation of liberalism, which states that in a government, one forfeits certain rights, certain liberties for the protection of greater overarching liberties. So we see that in his understanding of the social contract. Additionally, we understand that John Locke's work on universal and natural rights focuses on the goods of nature, that we have rights to the goods of nature, only when not limiting others from obtaining these same goods. So these works on individual liberties, natural rights, the concept of life, liberty, and property directly inspired many of our founding fathers. When we look at, we won't even spend too much time on his personal life beyond understanding that he was a young individual during the English Civil War. So I mentioned this before, the social contract. What even is the social contract? Well, it's defined as an exchange of certain rights for the protection of all others. Remember, you're forfeiting your right to pillage and steal for your right to be protected from that and other threats that could come in the state of nature. We enter, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke, we enter into the social contract as individuals. We give individual consent to be governed through our practice within this system. Some argue, like John Locke, that private property predates the social contract, while others, like Thomas Hobbes, say we were not able to securely maintain private property until the social contract and the creation of the state. We see a famous quote from Locke, "For no government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it." End quote, representing classical liberalism with that quote and focusing on the requirements of the social contract. And remember those two laws of nature. We all desire peace. We are all willing to forfeit certain rights for the maintenance of peace. That is what eventually results in the social contract. Now, why are we talking about all this in an American government course? Well, let's look at the Declaration of Independence. We see our Declaration of Independence says directly that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Direct excerpt from our Declaration of Independence. We also see that this sentiment is echoed frequently through the works of John Locke and his work opposing tyrannical governments. We see a quote by John Locke stating, "The end of government is the good of mankind, and which is best for mankind, that the people should be always exposed to the boundless will of tyranny, or that the rulers should be sometimes liable to be opposed when they grow exorbitant in the use of their power and employ it for the destruction and not the preservation of the properties of their people." End quote. Focusing on the responsibility of individuals to fight against tyranny and maintain the best practice to ensure the safety and happiness of their communities. Our Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, continues on to say, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Well, rewinding time a little bit, we see John Locke writing, quote, "Man being born, as has been proved, with the title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature," the state of nature, "equally with any other man, or number of men in the world, hath by nature a power not only to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men." The origins of life, liberty, and property right there in the works of John Locke. To preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men. The Declaration of Independence was our founding fathers saying, "We have had enough infringement upon our property, that is, our life, our liberty, and our, as they like to reframe it, our pursuit to obtain happiness. Well, we must protect this from the injuries that comes from the overarching influence of British rule." So we, inspired by the works of John Locke, crafted a Declaration of Independence and started the trajectory that resulted in our government today. So let's rewind a bit and look at how John Locke's greater philosophies influenced the United States. And I look at three primary angles. Without going into detail on the specific texts of John Locke, I think it's important to make sure we understand the influence he's had. So first off, what we've talked the most about. He has a heavy focus on individual rights and the natural human rights. We see that his focus on individuality and individual rights provided our protections of state sovereignty and individual liberties through the Bill of Rights. Without John Locke's philosophies, we might not have had the Bill of Rights work as a compromise for our anti-federalists to later ratify the Constitution, and maybe would not have ended in the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Now, when we look at the specific text of our Constitution, we see some emphases on the importance of education. And we see that maintained throughout U.S. history. As we see John Locke in his early works, specifically two treatises of government, wrote a concept about tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is the concept that all humans are born with a blank slate, like animals without intuition, I guess you could say. And throughout our lived experiences, we form who we are today. We are who we are due exclusively to our lives. So education is essential. We must create good humans through education. And finally, we know that our early formation of government, our First Amendment, focuses on a protection of a maintenance of religious tolerance. Again, would not have this without the work of John Locke, as he provided 3 reasons in the 2 treatises of government why it is not only morally right to allow religious tolerance, but rational and utilitarian to maintain religious tolerance. The first reasoning being, no individual alive on this planet cannot determine the validity of a single religion over other religions. Second, no individual on this planet can be compelled into belief by force. You cannot force an individual to truly believe another religion that they do not believe. And 3, enforcing a single religion within a society has historically created more social disorder than allowing the diversity of thought. These 3 reasons act as why John Locke successfully inspired our founding fathers to maintain protections of religious freedoms within our Constitution. Now, I include this picture here because, well, remember we're talking about the 1790s, and you see the date there, 1793, and the conflict and tensions present in Europe, and how the Federalists advocating for alliances with Britain, the Democratic Republicans advocating for alliances with France, the Jay Treaty seemingly identifying us on the British side of the conflict. I like to use this slide to illustrate this conflict through political theory and political philosophy. There was a conflict between how we could even view liberty. Remember, it's the greatest freedom that is consistent with the freedom of others. But liberty, as we focused on in week 1, can see it can be defined very differently based on the community and the origins of thought. We saw at the time British liberty being viewed as religious affiliation, loyalty, obedience to the law, independence, personal security, justice, inheritance. Remember that inheritance of past progress and generations, protection of property and industry, national prosperity and happiness, while the French liberty, more representative of atheism, rebellion, treason, anarchy, murder at times, equality, madness, cruelty, injustice, treachery, ingratitude, idleness, famine, national and private ruin and misery. Maybe this is framed in favor of British liberty here, but we see this conflict between the British and French understandings and framings of liberty through this political cartoon and graphic visualized and distributed frequently throughout the time. Of course, we do know French liberty is not today defined by this conflict and strife, but we can see how different interpretations of liberty in different environments can be quite influential on our perceptions of government. So, before we wrap up today's lecture, I just wanted to cover some quick economic political theories and really just give us some concrete definitions so we don't use these terms in the inflammatory ways that we have seen them used around us in daily lives. So, we're going to cover very briefly so you can use them if you need to in your discussions and term paper, the terms capitalism, socialism, and communism. Capitalism, the only way we will allow these terms to be utilized. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Competition and price are essential ingredients to this economic system. We see Adam Smith advocating for the sentiments of capitalism in The Wealth of Nations, also known as a liberal thinker throughout history, but Adam Smith argues that there is a mechanism called the invisible hand that regulates the economy. The government does not need to interfere because the invisible hand uses mechanisms like competition and price to maintain a perfect balance within our economies, within our markets. And we see capitalism generally understood as present in all Western democracies to date. Now, let's look at the work of Karl Marx and 2 terms that he brought into the greater sphere of political theory, socialism and communism. Well, socialism is where there is an attempt for equal share of profit and property among all citizens. Equal share of profit and property among all citizens is the definition of socialism, which will be used in our course. This requires the centralization of wealth for adequate redistribution. This is oftentimes where real-world applications of socialism have met their demise, and we've seen conflict occur at the centralization of resources point. Although we have not had a depth of applications of these practices, and it is important to understand that when you look at Karl Marx's ideology, socialism is not an end goal of any state. Socialism is a means to obtain the end goal of communism. What do I mean by that? Well, Karl Marx identifies a progression of history, starting with feudalism, ending with communism. Socialism is a middle step within that progression of history as we go from a capitalist society to a communist society, as we have an inadequate distribution of wealth in a capitalist society, as price and competition does not allow for perfect equal distribution. So socialism would be the period in which wealth and resources are concentrated and then redistributed. Once resources are perfectly redistributed, then we enter a stage of communism, according to Karl Marx. So before we enter communism, let's recap on socialism. It is the equal share of profit and property among all citizens, requiring the centralization of wealth and resources to be redistributed equally. Karl Marx viewed socialism as a required step towards communism and not an end goal in itself. And it is also worth noting, within a socialist economy, you have a prioritization of economic redistributive policies. Many policies of economic redistribution exist in modern capitalist states. Think of simple tax systems. Think of welfare redistribution. Think of any form of redistributing wealth. The state collecting taxes and then redistributing that wealth to build up certain industries is a form of economic redistribution. And we see these policies coexisting within capitalist economies and not representing a demise of capitalism in itself. We also, and actually in nearly all Western democracies, some form of economic redistribution is present. We also see communism. The end goal of Karl Marx is a complete absence of money and private ownership. So Karl Marx's story would go, capitalism exists, and it is so detrimental that we need to go into a period of socialism to concentrate wealth and then redistribute it. After we've redistributed all of the wealth and there is no longer any capital held by the central entity, then we have abolished private ownership. Now we have perfect redistribution, and all goods are in public ownership. There is absolute public control of all land and property. After we've perfectly redistributed it, we all work in the dimension that we are capable, and we all obtain the fruits of all of our labors. Karl Marx argued that workers were being exploited in the capitalist system because they did not have the means of production, and owners of production were profiting off of simple ownership, while the greater working class was required to have their time and abilities, their work with their hands as their commodities, while owners of production, their commodities were the things that they owned, which did not require any attention. Without any perspectives being portrayed on these concepts, it is important to understand what they are and their origins. And I created these slides off of the foundations of thought obtained through Adam Smith presenting capitalism, and primarily laissez-faire capitalism, and Karl Marx presenting the transitionary period of socialism and the end goal of communism. So what do we learn? Here are the overarching questions. Simple this week. They're not going to be on quiz 1, although they may resurface towards the end of the semester. And if you use these terms inadequately in discussions or in the term paper, it may result in a deduction in your score. Here are the concrete definitions and final answers. What's due? Complete your quiz. It's on Eagle Online. It's accessible. It's ready right now. So go ahead and take that whenever you're ready, but make sure you review all of the What Did We Learn slides from weeks 1, 2, and 3. And yeah, if you have any questions about the content, just reach out. I'm happy to review it with you. I'm happy to schedule a Zoom. If you're curious about your term paper, reach out. Let's talk. And yeah, and if you're doing a constitutional amendment term paper, please reach out to me to schedule a Zoom because it is essential that we have a understanding of how we're going to structure your paper as it's a little unique compared to the others. All right, thank you guys. See you next week, and hopefully I'll talk to you via the emails.